Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm assuming we're all dialing in from all over the world. Thank you so much for making time to join us today in what promises to be a really exciting conversation. My name is Frank Kaswani, and we're excited to host you today together the Lilly Family and School of Philanthropy on this really interesting topic around higher education and philanthropy in Sub-Saharan Africa, the enabling environment. This webinar is going to focus on the enabling legal and regulatory environment for philanthropy, really looking at the space of higher education in Sub-Saharan Africa. And through the conversations today with what is a really top-level and top-notch panel, we'll be looking to see how we can talk through the conversations around the philanthropic ecosystem for higher education in Africa, to really explore the opportunities and challenges that the enabling and legal and regulatory environment for philanthropy brings to donors, academic officers, and both public and private universities. The webinar will also share findings from the 2022 Global Philanthropy Environment Index in a short presentation that will be done by Una. So as we go through this conversation, we're really excited about what will come through. And as I do a very quick and rapid introduction of the speakers, because we really want to get into the meat of the conversation, can you please do me a favor and use the chat to, one, introduce yourself, your name, your organization, as in whether you're an institution of learning or a university or just you're here out of interest, and which country you're coming from. So your name, your organization, and which country you're dialing in from. Just use the chat so we can get to know each other informally. But I'm really honored today to share this webinar and bring to you four really strong speakers. Roberta Bassett from the World Bank. She's the global lead for tertiary education and senior education specialist. Una, who's the Associate Dean for Research and International Programs at IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, and a Professor of Economics and Philanthropic Studies. Tendai Murisa, who's an Executive Director, Sivyo Institute in Zimbabwe, and Dr. Cyrus Sebugenyi, who's the Head of Standards and Qualifications, National Council of Higher Education in Uganda. So we're really pleased and looking forward to a really engaging conversation with this particular group of people. So please use the chat function in the meantime to introduce yourself. And as we go through that exercise, I'll welcome Una to give us a bit of a heads up about the study that was done. Una, welcome and over to you.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to join you all from the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. We are delighted and honored to have this distinguished group of panelists and experts, but also people who are very close to the practice of philanthropy and higher education in Africa. As we all know, this is a complex time globally, but also a time of a lot of opportunity. When it comes to the African continent in particular, we have to lift up some key points. First, Africa has the youngest youngest age profile of any other continent. More than 50% of its population is under 15. So when you think about higher education, there's tremendous potential to be unlocked. At the same time, we also know that higher education institutions are facing a number of challenges, both on the financial and fiscal side, but also in terms of operating and carrying out their day-to-day activities. So to help set the stage for today's conversation, I'd like to bring you the enabling environment for philanthropy in Africa, the big picture. Here at the Lilly Family School, we work on the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. We're in the field right now to launch the 2025 index. But today we're going to take a deeper dive into the data collected as part of the last GPEI. So I'll start by giving you the overall context of the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, and then provide a deeper dive into what we're finding on the African continent. And I also want to use this opportunity to thank all of our collaborators. We work with an extensive group of country and regional experts for the GPEI every year. And also to thank our team here at the Lilly Family School. We have a fantastic team of scholars, of practitioners, and people working in the field of philanthropy. And so you'll get a chance to just get a snapshot of what those results are like. And then as a follow-up, I want to invite you to actually go and visit our website and download the individual country and regional reports and spend some time reading the brief. It's only a short brief, so it doesn't take too much time. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And please do send in your questions as we go forward. So today I'd like to focus on the enabling environment for philanthropy in Africa. And because our conversation is about higher education in particular, we're going to talk about what are the factors that can boost higher education philanthropy from an enabling environment perspective, but also what's holding philanthropy back as it relates to higher education. As I noted, this is a very timely topic because of the potential of the youth on the continent, and also the role that higher education plays in providing solutions to a lot of the challenges facing individual countries and the continent as a whole. To take a big picture view of this, here at the Lilly Family School, we work around the year on the Global Philanthropy Environment Index. This report provides very timely, comprehensive, and easily accessible information about philanthropy in over 100 or over 90 countries, but we work with about 100 country-based experts. The goal of this project is to provide both a big picture, but also a deeper dive picture of how philanthropy can evolve and how it can thrive in regions and cultures around the world. When it comes to the Global Philanthropy Environment Index at a global level, we are covering over 90 countries and economies, as I noted, and we also highlight places in the world where philanthropy is growing, where it's constrained, and also what are those factors that can move the needle or start to shift the conversation around philanthropy. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of variation in the country level findings and scores, and some surprises in the data. So I encourage you to do take some time after this webinar to visit the website, to spend some time looking closely at the country level environments, and also seeing what those changes are over time. So let me just highlight one key finding from the report, which I think is an important takeaway. When we look across the 91 economies that we study, we find that about 38%, so really 40% of the economies that we study have a restrictive environment around philanthropy, which means there are factors holding philanthropy back, and this would, of course, include higher education. In contrast, we find about 60% of economies in the world are favorable towards philanthropy. And you might say, what does that mean? As we look at the data, it means there are overly burdensome restrictions around giving, there are constraints around cross-border giving. Often, sometimes it's setting up an organization. It may even be constraints around fundraising and ability to operate a nonprofit organization. So looking across the board, we see that there's a lot of potential to improve the philanthropic environment. And when we think about higher education in particular, we know that for many donors, these barriers can actually prevent or inhibit their ability to give. For the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, just to preview the specific factors that we look at, we spend a lot of time on the ease of operating a philanthropic organization. How long does it take to set up an organization? Is there government interference around some of those operations? Similar to the ease of doing business, how easy is it to conduct philanthropic activities? An important area, especially on the African continent, and you'll hear more about this, is the role that tax incentives play. We know that increasingly in many different parts of the world, there are incentives associated with giving, either for individual donors, corporate donors, and in some cases around foundation donors. So we take a deeper dive for each of the countries we look at on the tax incentives. A very important topic, especially in the context of the African continent, is how easy is it to give across borders? We know that especially as we look at the African continent, there are a number of restrictions around cross-border donations, some of them linked to anti-money laundering or terror-related activities, but those then spill over into the philanthropic sphere. Three areas that I just want to highlight that we've increasingly begun to pay attention to here at the Lilly Family School is the role of the political environment, the economic environment, and the sociocultural environment. All of these are more important than ever on the African continent. And so as we look across the globe, on the most recent Global Philanthropy Environment Index, you'll note that there's quite a bit of variation across the board. And when we look at the African continent, overall, those scores perhaps tend to be on the lower side, in contrast to what we see for other parts of the world, especially when we look at Asia and parts of Europe and the Caribbean. Africa seems to be underperforming as far as the Global Philanthropy Environment Index, but there are some areas where we see a lot of strengths within the African continent and places where other parts of the world can also learn from what's taking place on the continent. So with that as a bit of a background, let's drill down and focus in on the African continent. I should note that this is a topic, of course, that's very close to my own background. I grew up in Nigeria, grew up on a college campus, care very much about what's taking place, not just on the continent, but specifically related to higher education. So let's spend some time on what we learned from our work on the African continent. For the Global Philanthropy Environment Africa edition, we highlighted 13 African countries and economies. Those economies you can see on your screen are the ones that are shaded. Of course, there's a lot of potential to expand and include every single African country, and that's actually our ambition. So if you are interested in joining this project and contributing, and you see a country here that is not included, we'd love to hear from you. This is an open invitation. You can see that there is quite a bit of variation even within the African continent. We tend to see higher scores. You can see South Africa in particular is on the higher side, the Southern Africa hemisphere. We also see a lot of opportunity for improvement, particularly for some of the Northern African countries that we look at. So taken together as a whole, and see the average score for the African continent is a bit below the global average. And East Africa in particular also performs quite well. And I think there's some very positive developments within East Africa, especially around the cross-border giving component. So with that as a bit of an intro, let's now turn to the specific factors and how our African economies and countries stack up, especially when we compare them to what's taking place on the global scale. I should note that the last few years have been a time of a lot of experimentation around the world. We're seeing a lot of new policies around philanthropy, some of those coming from within philanthropic organizations. We're seeing a lot of innovation in the space with impact investing, crowdfunding, and many new forms of giving emerge. We also know that on the African continent, there's a rich history of philanthropy, some of it faith-based, some of it person-to-person. And during the past few years with the global pandemic and many of the other shocks we've seen, a lot of interest in supporting local organizations, grassroots organizations, and also centering on equity. So as all of this is taking place, what we've noticed is that there are some areas where there's an opportunity to improve the philanthropic environment. I'll start with the ease of operating philanthropic organizations. You can see overall, Northern Africa tends to perform less well on this particular index compared to other parts of the continent. And here is where we see the Southern Africa ease of operating a philanthropic organization take the lead. Why is it important to highlight these variations? Because we also see that countries can learn from each other where those policies are making a difference in improving the lives of citizens and community groups. They can kind of learn from each other. So the ease of operating a philanthropic organization is similar to what we've seen in terms of the ease of doing business. How long does it take to establish an organization? what are the regulations and requirements that involve. Now, turning our attention to tax incentives, which is something that is quite pertinent to our discussion on higher education. We hear a lot from high net worth donors on the continent, as well as companies and foundations, that one thing that's holding philanthropy back is the lack of a transparent and systemic and comprehensive approach to providing incentives around charitable giving. Here we also note the variation across the continent. In many cases, East Africa tends to have perhaps more of these tax incentives that are being developed. We know that there are several countries that are looking into specific opportunities around tax incentives, and a lot of interest in how to provide more tax incentives for corporations. So within the report, you'll see individual countries and some of the policies that they have implemented. But it's worth noting that around the world, where we've seen a lot of movement in philanthropy, there have often been it's often paralleled by a close look at the policy environment and incentivizing philanthropic action rather than constraining. As we go to the next slide, a place that we have spent a lot of time on is the role of cross-border restrictions. Often individuals on the African continent have, especially when we look by region, whether it's West Africa, East Africa, or Southern Africa, these are economies that are very closely linked in trade and commerce. And as we look at the philanthropic environment, it's also clear that there are a number of restrictions that really hold people back from giving across borders. Most notably in North Africa as a whole, that seems to be a place where there's a lot of opportunity to improve the regulatory environment to make it easier for individuals to give across borders. As we turn our attention to some of the other factors that are influencing philanthropy on the continent, one factor that really stands out is the political environment. I'm an economist by training, and I think at the beginning of this project, I really thought that the economy would really be the key driver. But we also noted that in environments that are politically unstable and where individuals are faced with uncertainty, that does not just affect other types of investment, but also influences philanthropic action. And as we look at the data from the African continent, we also note that regions and countries that are dealing with instability are also facing a number of philanthropic barriers. And the reason this is worth highlighting is that it's precisely in these types of political environments where philanthropy is needed, but it also is an environment that tends to hold donors back. And then finally, I just want to highlight two other areas that are of very, I think, relevant items to bring up for the higher education environment in Africa. First, the economic environment. We tend to see that individuals give, corporations give, and also other types of funders participate in philanthropy when they have the resources to give. In the past few years, the African continent has dealt with a number of COVID-related shocks that have set economies back, and you can see that that influences the philanthropic environment. And then finally, the sociocultural environment, probably one of the biggest assets related to giving, is the strong foundation of many African countries, African economies, and African societies, where across all levels of society, we see high rates of giving, high interest in philanthropy. And you can see that that is probably one of the areas where Africa scores the highest. In fact, perhaps even outpacing some of its global counterparts. So I'll just wrap up by inviting you to review the entire report, and also note that looking ahead, we have a number of really exciting developments on the continent, with technology allowing individuals to give across borders, with artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, many other new ways of giving that are powering new relationships between higher education and its donors. We also see changing legislation and evolving relationships between governments and other partners. And another very exciting development related to higher education is the role the diaspora community can play. So I will just say that looking ahead, please visit the Lilly Family School website to read the entire report. And we look forward to your questions, your comments, and your insights throughout the webinar. And with this, I'll turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you.
Well, no, fantastic. That was really cool. Thank you so much for succinctly putting that study in a brief and short context. I was particularly reading the study earlier. I was particularly excited that you looked at some things that I think in Africa generally neglected, most of things like social-cultural environment. I think many people sometimes underestimate how much Africans give through other channels. People sometimes probably don't look at how much we give, for example, to our religious organizations. There was an unconfirmed report, for example, that Kenyans give about $60 million to the church every Sunday. Imagine if that money could be put towards impact-related investments in one form or another, it would be phenomenal. So if Kenyans are doing 60 million, you don't want to imagine what Nigerians and South Africans are doing. They're probably solving the world's problems every Sunday. Anyway, as we go through this, I'd like to welcome my panelists to please switch on their cameras so we can come online. And I'd love to engage them in a couple of questions. To the audience, as we go through the next 20 or so minutes of conversation, please do put your questions in the Q&A, this time not the chat. Sorry about that in the initial part of the webinar. Put your questions in the Q&A so we can try and get to as many of them as possible. Sungju Kim, thank you for your question. Let's have a few more from people as we go along, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. For those of you who haven't introduced yourself, please do use the chat to introduce yourself so we can get to know each other a bit better. So once again, Roberta, Cyrus, and Tendai, welcome, and thank you for making yourself available to be part of this interesting conversation. So I do want to start with a question specifically, first of all, to Tendai and Cyrus. Very briefly, if you look at the significant official development assistance aid funding that's been poured into supporting and expanding both public and private institutions of higher education in Africa, in what spheres of higher education can private philanthropy, especially funds sourced from within Africa, be used most effectively to create a sector that is both resilient and able to grow strategically? Tendai, we begin with you.
Thank you so much, Frank, and welcome everybody, and thanks for having me. I think it's to understand global philanthropy, or to understand philanthropy vis-a-vis the moment that we're living in. We are coming from an era of disinvestment in higher education, radical disinvestment, that even individual countries are investing less in higher education. Globally, there are fewer resources that are going towards supporting higher education. So the low-hanging fruit that we have seen from high net worth individuals across Africa has been support through scholarships. Because the issue around access to higher education has been an issue. So we have been seeing that many falling behind because they cannot afford the privatized or the commercialized public institutions that are now charging commercial fees. So the intervention of private philanthropy has been very significant in terms of making sure that kids, learners from challenged backgrounds, in terms of economic backgrounds, can also have an access to higher education. That is number one. But number two, and more importantly, the higher education infrastructure across Africa is aging. So we begin to see some philanthropists beginning to invest in physical infrastructure within universities, rather than building new universities, but partnering with existing universities and updating or upgrading the existing infrastructure. So that's number two. And number three, it's also the fact that whether we like it or not, the African higher education ecosystem in some ways still lags behind what happens in the global north. So we've seen private philanthropy come in and making investments in terms of, again, scholarships, but these scholarships aimed at making sure that learners from Africa can also go and get an education from the first world. And those learners can come back and reinvest in Africa. So I think those three have been very important in terms of investments. And also the fourth one around just upgrading the technology within higher education institutions. But what is lacking is the influence of private philanthropy in terms of influencing higher education policy. So we are yet to see private philanthropists getting into the policy space in terms of trying to say what is the best or optimal model in terms of financing agriculture, higher education and also sustaining it, and how do we fund the sector? So policy conversations are not yet happening the way we would want them to happen. When I was with Trust Africa in 2016, we hosted the Africa Higher Education Summit, which was an attempt to bring together actors within that ecosystem of higher education and to begin to say, what should be the consensus? What should be African governments doing? What is the role of private philanthropy? I think that conversation needs to be revisited in terms of understanding how we can make sure that private philanthropy has a stake and is contributing towards a more sustainable higher education sector. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, Tendai. A bit later, I'd like to come back to you to just give us some sense of what is the opportunity cost of this problem not being addressed. If we continue living in the current state, where could we possibly end up? So I'll come back to you on that one. Cyrus, do you have anything to add to what Tendai has just put forward?
Yeah, thank you. He has actually done a very good job, but I want to add on that given the cases that we are seeing, especially here in my country, Uganda, we see donors, philanthropies coming in to support the investments, because you see, yes, they build infrastructure today, they support staff today, but how will the university maintain the infrastructure tomorrow? So we have seen cases of philanthropies coming in to do investments which the university can thrive on the following day. It has also talked about technological development. Yes, this has happened a lot, especially about 20 years ago in Makerere University, where there was no internet, and the donors came in to support the building of the internet infrastructure and connecting the whole university. And so this is important. Maybe what hasn't talked about is the issue of staff development, because one of the things that we are grappling with in Uganda is still we are still having very few PhD holders. These are the teachers who are supposed to spearhead over higher education in our country, but still the PhD holders are quite few. And we have seen some donors coming in to support this area, but I think there is still a need to support this area, and you see it's quite expensive, because if a university is going to send her lecturers, her assistant lecturers to go abroad to the US, to Europe to study, is quite expensive. So this is another area where I think they could put their hand to. Thank you.
Okay, and Roberta, if I bring it into the next question. So if we look at institutions of higher education throughout the world, regardless of the public or private status, they employ a mix of business models, in essence, for them to survive. So in accessing philanthropic funds, in what ways are either public or private universities challenged by the legal or regulatory environment to successfully fundraise, while also receiving revenue from tuition, government grants, etc.?
Thanks, Frank. This is an extremely interesting conversation, because so much of this private philanthropy question actually mirrors the public donor question. What do governments do in terms of bilateral or regional aid to countries through their development funds? What does the World Bank do? So it's a very interesting question. I used to teach in university in the UK, and one of the conversations I had all the time with my staff members, do you donate to your institutions? And zero do they donate. So there's a big cultural challenge about who donates to what. And I think that's sort of, if the study could drill down further into education specific donations, I think you'd find an even greater variation globally on who donates to education as a whole and who donates to higher education, because in most of the world it's unheard of. I mean, it's the tiny little amounts. And so this conversation really is an important one, because as Cyrus said, and as my colleague said earlier from South Africa, the pinpoint focus on private donations, usually for buildings, often for, can you not hear? Frank, can you hear? Okay, often for scholarships. Okay, very good. I know you're making a signal. Doesn't lead to systemic change. It doesn't lead to cultural change, right? The goal really needs to be this broad cultural shift. And Una mentioned that when you include sort of economic issues, when you include especially socio-cultural issues, and you alluded to this as well, there are norms for donating. Donating to education is very little. Donating to higher education, which is fundamentally an elite activity in most of the low and middle income countries of the world, still becomes a harder sell. It's true for the World Bank. I spend all of my time convincing my colleagues that it's worth investing in tertiary education, and the same goes for philanthropic donors as well. So, how do you shift thinking to move the needle for impact-oriented donations is the fundamental question. And if you can target higher education as a place that can make these big shifts in all of the answering big questions, climate change, gender issues, infrastructure development, you can see higher education as a way to be the conduit to those solutions. It can redirect philanthropic donations into higher education in a way that is not normal in most of the world right now.
So Roberta, I'll come back to you later with another question around this impact-related donations, because part of it is, when you fundraise and you look at most nonprofits, they tend to attract funding based on the kind of impact of outcomes they're having. And are we measuring higher education institutions well enough to really, especially fund the ones that are giving out the best impact? So I'll come back to that. But before that question, I have another question for you. In your work with the World Bank, you've had the opportunity to work in numerous regions in the world, working to support tertiary education. So in looking at East and Southern Africa, could you speak to some of the bright spots where governments, universities, and African-based donors have had successes in working together to create a stronger institutional framework for resilient higher education environment?
Yes, thanks very much. This is a fundamental question. I think one that the African Union and the European Union have created a new partnership around. Also, the World Bank's strategic direction for Africa is focused on this. So this is the big question on how we can create resilience in the higher education system using every stakeholder, right? That is inclusive of the private sector, labor market, private sector, and donors. And I know this conversation is largely around donors. We include both in our conversation around the private sector. It's Microsoft as an employer and the Microsoft Foundation, right? We care about both of those actors on the ground in our countries. Some of the bright spots, and I will focus on that. We could talk for hours about this issue, but we do have this major initiative across Sub-Saharan Africa called the African Centers of Excellence Initiative that is now in 80 centers of excellence in 25 countries. It's around $700 million. And one of the key exercises in this effort, we have 8 countries in East and Southern Africa and 24 centers of excellence there, is this incubation center idea, this idea that commercialization of research can be Africa grounded and can be Africa funded. And we have brought in a lot of the diaspora. So Una mentioned this as well. We have on our steering committee diaspora representatives. We also have sort of private equity and venture capital sort of networks being built around these integration of research into commercialization efforts that then can yield entrepreneurial outcomes. And every country wants to have a Silicon Valley. Every country wants to be able to see that their economy is being driven by tech. I think for Africa, because of the infrastructure challenges, this does require a much broader stakeholder community to be investing in this space, which is why we are looking to the diaspora and philanthropic agents within that space to kind of provide not just the financing and the capital, although that is a key issue, I mean, maybe the key issue, but also the talent and the experience on how one does these things. How do you bring an idea into a commercial element and then create a business from that? There's still, I think, quite a weak infrastructure for that in the environments where we work, and that needs a lot of external support in the building, and that will be philanthropic. It will be also from the investment community, and some of those things go hand in hand, right? Many investment agents also have foundation arms that then start the exercise on the ground, and then the commercial arm comes in and invests in it after, right? So it can be a very complementary relationship. But the African Centers of Excellence Initiative is one that the bank has been partnering with the African Association of Universities and the East African Commission, utilizing the Inter-University Council of East Africa, to create this large facilitated stakeholder engagement around exactly the type of issues that we're discussing today.
Yeah, Roberta, I totally agree with you. In fact, the whole concept of having philanthropy lead some of these things, because philanthropy can take the kind of risks that private capital. But private capital has a lot more scale impact than philanthropy does. So in essence, from where we stand, in fact, at AVPA, the world of impact isn't short of money, we're short of risk capital to be able to test some of these new innovations when they're still very risky, to the point of proof of concept and where more private capital can come in. So I think there's such a critical part for philanthropy to play in being able to fund innovation and fund scaling up of new models that I think nothing else can do. So I strongly believe, and I agree with you, that without philanthropy playing that role, we'll never get the kind of capital to drive higher education to where we need to go by crowding private capital into this particular environment. So totally agree with you. So let me come to Tendai. So Tendai, you've done previous research that has examined the role of high net worth individuals in Africa-sourced philanthropy. So if homegrown philanthropy is a pathway to bridging the gap between Africa's potential and its reality, can you speak to how the enabling environment in African countries is either supportive or discouraging to an increase in giving by high net worth individuals towards higher education?
Okay, thank you very much for that. I think the presentation from Prof. Unai really helped in terms of framing the environment and the changes. And I think what we can see on a Pan-African scale is actually that the environment for philanthropy is vastly improving. So there are opportunities in what were previously closed countries like Ethiopia, where we're actually seeing changes. But it's worrying that in other countries that were open before, like Tanzania, we're beginning to see those changes. But I want to come back to the issue of regulation vis-a-vis high net worth individuals. High net worth individuals and the corporates they establish tend to be mostly, when you're looking on the African scale, they are Pan-African in terms of their business footprint. But when it comes to their giving footprint, it tends to be limited to the source country. So if you find, for instance, let's use Nigeria as an example. I use the Dangote Foundation. The Dangote Foundation, Dangote as a corporate is a Pan-African organization. But if you look at their giving, it's concentrated in Nigeria. So there's already that challenge that philanthropists limit themselves. Before we talk of cross-border limitations, philanthropists at times limit themselves. They go back to where they came from and they begin to look at that. So that has also taught us that, number one, before you talk about the enabling environment, you have to look at their strategies and understand, and also how you can excite them to think and to sort of give at a Pan-African scale. So that's one thing that we're dealing with. Then secondly, it's also this issue that, and we're fortunate that today we're discussing higher education. Higher education, in terms of being politically sensitive, tends to be lower. So many governments are not going to be affected or to be sort of worried that somebody is coming to make huge investments in education compared, say, to the governance infrastructure, other things to do with making sure that governments are accountable. So higher education, you find that in many instances, most of the high net worth individuals who have set up private foundations are actually investing in higher education. But their most preferred route is scholarships. And it's in two ways. It's either scholarships to send kids abroad or within their countries. So the flow of money has not yet become a major issue operationally, because they, unlike, say, a US foundation that is to give across Africa, they rarely do that. They find themselves working within one jurisdiction, maybe in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, or in South Africa. But they begin to be affected when they are sending learners to other places. That's when they have to move money. But also the challenge now is already around, we do not know much about their giving, because like you said, this role of religion also plays a part in how they report on their giving, because religious values actually at times demand for them not to be reporting on their giving. So what we have is actually surface data to begin to say, oh, we only know that they give so much on what they declare, but they give much, much more. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because I want to talk about tax incentives. If there was a robust tax incentive framework across Africa, high net worth individuals and the foundations they established will be more compelled to report on their giving based on the incentive that they begin to receive on tax deductibility, etc. So the challenge we have, except for South Africa and Mauritius, is that the tax incentives are not operational in many African countries. So the more they give, from the interviews I held, the more they give, they're actually under threat from the revenue authorities in their countries to say, if you are giving so much, you're most likely you have made more money. So now we begin to go into your books to try to investigate. So our advocacy in this space has been to say that the revenue authorities the ministries of finance, etc., need to recognize private philanthropy as a pillar of development, like they have done in Rwanda. In Rwanda, there's now an office for philanthropy. So if they could come to that level, then we can begin to see maybe a better managed sector, and we can begin to track its growth. Because at the moment, because of the sort of the chasing around taxes, etc., we are not so sure about the exact amounts that are being moved. So some of the data is anecdotal, some of the data is not 100% clear. But what we can see is that if there was to be a tax framework whereby giving is also incentivized, we could actually see that happening. But finally, before I hand back to you, Frank, is also that we're just not looking at high net worth individuals in terms of the billionaires, but we're looking also at the millionaires and the rising middle class in Africa. And also the importance then of understanding how tech facilitates giving within countries and across countries. So we're excited about what we are seeing in the East African region, especially in Kenya, around giving using mobile telephony, etc., and also the emergence of alumni associations, etc., that were being referred to say, if we can begin to see that, then the giving does not only become the responsibility of high net worth, the ultra high net worth, but almost the image, because what is emerging in Africa and what is significant is the middle class itself, because that's what is growing. So you can tap into that and begin to have these huge universities that have a long history, established in the 50s and 60s, to have alumni funds, because many of them don't even have alumni offices. So they're not tapping into that network, etc., to begin to grow their own endowments like universities in the global north. So when we begin to see that and marry that with the growth of technology, we can begin to see something. And also, we're not yet clear about what kind of sort of regulatory challenges those funds will face. But again, we need to be piloting this.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing says about how do you diversify your revenue stream across multiple donors. You know, I used to work at the African Leadership Academy, and it was very interesting. The kids we sent to the US, they started making contributions to their schools the day they entered those colleges. And the African kids were never made as young donors. They were not put into the practice of giving back that early. So that's something I think we have to look at. And most of us went to university in Africa. I don't think any of us has ever been hit up by our colleges for a donation. That's very fascinating. But also just touching on the tax incentive. So there's taxes that the philanthropic organizations can get, like income tax, tax breaks and those kind of things. But also those who are donating to these organizations, can they get tax breaks for the donations they make to philanthropic organizations? And I think that there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done there. So in fact, when I was looking at the index, I realized that instinctively, I thought South Africa might be the leading, but I was surprised to see that there are a lot of other countries where the tax incentives are actually performing much better. So a lot of lessons for us to learn from each other. So Cyrus, let me come back to you for the next question. And in your role in ensuring that the national standards are followed, what are some of the best practices that you have seen amongst either public or private universities in financial transparency that might facilitate and improve willingness to give philanthropy to support these schools? So who's out there being very transparent about their financial and everything so they can attract donors? And how does the legal framework in Uganda foster individual and corporate giving to higher education? And just a final part of that question is there a different regulatory treatment for public versus private institutions in terms of fundraising from these sources?
Frank, thank you so much. I'll try to begin with the last part of the question. The law, the legal framework governing the setup and the running of higher education institutions in Uganda is the Universities and Other Tertiary Institutions Act, which covers both public and private institutions. And large and by, there is a lot of commonality, there's also similarity. However, the privates, they're also governed by the Public Finance Management Act, and they're audited by the government auditor general of the government. So that's kind of the difference. But the other bureaucrats that is normally found in the government, in public institution, but large and by, these are governed by the same law. And the same law, especially when it comes to private, there are three stages for establishing a private university in Uganda. which is the first one, the letter of interim authority. And what the letter of interim authority does is to give you the platform as an institution that's being set up to mobilize resources. So you can see even the early setup of a university. My apologies, my network has been interrupted a bit, but is with the public institution. Now, in the setup, when universities are being set up, there is a whole governance and management framework that is expected for each university, whether private or public. The governing councils, the management committees, and what is key is that every governing council of a university, whether private or public, has a committee responsible for finance, and this committee is responsible for budgeting and approving budgets of the university, as well as accountability mechanisms to put the managers. That's where the managers go for accountability. So, large and by, the regulatory framework is there. It's actually very solid in both private and public universities. But I'll go to the issue of the best practices, and I still begin with that. There is a very good accountability mechanism between the players, the managers, as well as the governors, and to some extent for public, the owners, and also the public accountability. The public universities, they're accountable, they are called upon to the parliament, they are scrutinized. So there is a whole accountability mechanism for all institutions in Uganda. That's number one. Number two, that when you look at where money has gone before, there are tangible outcomes. When you see the infrastructure that has been developed, when you see people, students, graduates who have come out of these donor supports, the girls, the lecturers who have gotten PhDs, including myself, they are quite a number. So there are these tangible outcomes that you look up to and you say, oh, these are the success stories. I therefore can put money at this side. The other one is that they are proper reporting mechanisms. For example, when money is received, the university is required to report on how much money they have received and how much money has been spent. This is really a good practice. I would also say that the timely utilization of resources, when money is brought in 2024 and the project life is 1 year, you expect, and has actually been done, that this money is being used for the purpose for which it was set up. So there are quite a number of best practices, and I've actually seen some of the outcomes that come out, especially the research funding, the publication, but also the impact of these intervention to the community. You can actually see this very clearly. So I would say that the best practices are quite many, but I will single out the accountability frameworks, reporting and frameworks that are in place, the councils, the committees, the policies. Actually, it's a requirement of the National Council for Education that every university must have a committee responsible for finance, but at the same time, there is annual reporting. Every university is required by the Act to report annually to the National Council for Education, to report to the minister, and lastly, the auditing. Whatever financial business that are being done by the university, they are required to be audited externally. The public ones, are audited by the Auditor General of the government, but also the councils are required to appoint the auditors to audit what is going on in the university. But maybe the very last is that when the donors give the money, they have also their accountability mechanisms, and this should actually continue. So when money is brought into a university, and their guidelines, their agreements which are signed, maybe that's also the best practice that I need to bring across, that the agreements, the donor agreements, when we have given you money, this is how you're going to use the money, this is how the purpose for which the money is going to be used. this is a good practice and actually has ensured that a lot of outcome is realized. I thank you, Frank.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I realize we are really short of time and we need to conclude this at the top of the hour. So I'm going to ask the speakers to please do me a favor and make some closing remarks, answering one particular question. If you're to advise the higher institutions of learning in this call about two things they need to do to be better positioned to attract capital, attract philanthropic money, what are the two things you'd like them to do? What are the two things they must do to also be attractive to philanthropists? So Roberta, can I start with you, and then I'll come to Tendai, and then I'll finish up with Cyrus before we give it up to Una to close for us.
Sure, thanks, Frank. I will say just very quickly, I would recommend the institutions be very clear about targeted outcomes that they're seeking to achieve utilizing the philanthropic donations, and that they have a plan for how they would do that and how they would measure it. So I agree with both Tendai and Cyrus. The really important thing is clear messaging, strategic focus, and a focus on the outcomes and impact that can be proven through proper monitoring and evaluation.
Okay, Tendai?
I think I'll just add, I was going to talk about vision, but I'll just add thinking on the edges, clear innovation around an asset-based approach. These universities have been churning thousands of graduates every year, but they have not been able to harness that as a source of funding. So if they can begin to learn from endowment funds that have been set up, alumnus funds that have been set up by Global North institutions, and try to replicate the model to really make sure that there is partnership between their former students and the university. But that will take transparency and a lot of accountability on how they use the resources they have for now.
Cyrus, your view?
Yes, two things. I'll just pick up from what Tendai has said. Number one is that I think for me, looking for donors, look for outside donors and also the local donors. Do not look at only the foreign ones, thinking that that's where money is, but also look at internally, little by little, as we normally say, as the saying goes, little by little makes a band. That's number one. Number two is that I think the university, especially here in my region, they should actually be strategic. They should look at the strategic focus of their governments. For example, in Uganda, the STEM, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics is key. So any focus, any kind of funding that people should look for is to build the STEM infrastructure, and that will be towards the development, the strategic and economic development of our country. Those are the two things that I'll put across to our institution of higher learning in Uganda and in the region.
So relevance, being clear about your outcomes, those are some of the things the panelists have highlighted. Man, I think I feel very robbed to only have had an hour to have this conversation. To the Lilly School, I highly beg you, can we carry this conversation for many days to come? I think deserving of a longer time for sure for discussion. To the panelists, thank you so much for your contribution. I'm really sorry we couldn't get to your questions of what is clearly a very exciting conversation. I highly suggest you follow up with the speakers and myself on LinkedIn. Let's try and finish this conversation offline. But what I'll do right now is, first of all, gratitude to the Lilly School and to all the panelists, but hand over to Una to please close for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been inspiring, I think exciting, stimulating, but it's also highlighted just how much work we all need to do to make sure that the African continent, our higher education institutions, and our countries can really tap into the potential that's there. I think just to summarize, I want to thank all the panelists, all of you who've joined us, but also a call to action and a reminder that the challenges ahead, the opportunities ahead, will need all of us working together, the private sector, philanthropy, and government. And we also need to harness the enabling environment to ensure that it provides the right incentives and also reduce the barriers to philanthropic action. So let's continue this conversation. And also, once again, thank you, appreciation, and special thanks to our moderator for, I think, providing such a wonderful platform for these discussions to take place. So enjoy the rest of the afternoon. You'll be hearing more from us. The Global Philanthropy Environment Index is in the field as we speak, and in 2025, we'll be releasing the updated version with new data, relevant data for the African continent and higher education. So thanks, everybody, and hope to continue this discussion with all of you in the future.
Thank you, everyone.